The day I discovered I was a thief began with the scent of jasmine. My mother-in-law had always insisted on burning these sickeningly sweet incense sticks throughout our Portland home, claiming they purified the energy. I never told her that. To me, they only ever smelled like deceit. Standing in my walk-in closet that crisp October morning, surrounded by the cloying fragrance, I noticed something odd. My jewelry box had been moved, ever so slightly. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. At first, I dismissed it. Claire, my mother-in-law, had been living with us for 3 months now, and she had a habit of reorganizing things without asking. But as I reached for my grandmother's sapphire pendant, the one thing I had left of her, my heart stopped. The velvet-lined drawer where I kept it was empty. I didn't panic, not immediately. After 6 years of marriage to David, I'd learned to keep my cool around Claire's little provocations. I methodically searched every drawer, then every shelf, then every corner of the closet. The pendant was gone, along with several other pieces I'd inherited. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone to text David, who had left early for his shift at the hospital. "Did you move my grandmother's pendant? Can't find it anywhere." The 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, "We need to talk when I get home. Don't go anywhere." Something in his tone, even through text, made my skin prickle. I'd been a corporate fraud investigator for 8 years. I knew when something wasn't adding up. I sat down on the edge of our bed, my mind racing through recent events. Claire moving in after her divorce, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms, the way she'd been documenting everything in our house with her iPad, claiming she was learning photography. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made me look up. Claire stood in the doorway, wrapped in her designer silk robe, her carefully maintained blonde hair already perfectly styled despite the early hour. She held her ever-present iPad like a shield. "Oh, Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with practiced concern. "Looking for something?" Before I could respond, my phone buzzed with another text from David. "Don't talk to my mother about this. Don't touch anything else. Just wait for me." The pieces started falling into place, and with them came a wave of nausea. Claire had been setting me up, methodically and carefully. But why? The answer hit me like a physical blow. The trust fund. David's grandfather had left him a substantial inheritance, but there was a clause. If he ever divorced, half would go to his ex-wife. Claire had never approved of me, the middle-class fraud investigator who'd ensnared her precious son. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice steady as I stood up, "I was looking for my grandmother's pendant. You wouldn't happen to know where it is, would you?" Claire's perfectly painted lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, darling," she purred. "I think we both know exactly where those pieces are. I told David you couldn't be. Trusted, but he wouldn't believe me. Not until I showed him proof." She turned her iPad toward me. On the screen was a series of photos. Me entering our bedroom at various times, my jewelry box open, close-ups of empty spots where pieces used to be. All carefully staged, all completely misleading, all building a false narrative of theft. "You've been planning this," I said, the realization dawning. "All those times you reorganized my closet, you were planting evidence. The incense, it's to cover the smell of the adhesive you used to tamper with the jewelry box locks, isn't it?" Claire's smile faltered for just a moment. She hadn't expected me to piece it together so quickly. Of course she hadn't. She'd forgotten what I did for a living. "You know," she said, recovering quickly, "for someone who investigates fraud, you're not very good at covering your tracks. Those pieces are worth quite a bit. Did you really think no one would notice them disappearing one by one?" I took a step toward her, my professional instincts kicking in. "Where are they, Claire? My grandmother's pendant, my mother's rings. Where did you hide them? She took a step back, clutching her iPad tighter. I've already told David everything. Show's over, Sarah. He knows what you are now. A thief. A fraud. Just like I always suspected. The sound of a car door slamming made us both turn. Through the bedroom window, I could see David's Tesla in the driveway. He wasn't supposed to be home for hours. Claire's smile turned triumphant. Right on time, she said softly. I suppose you'll want to pack a bag. Though really, everything in this house belongs to David. Best not to add to your crimes. I stood my ground, years of investigating corporate fraud giving me a steady voice despite my racing heart. David knows me. He knows I would never. David knows what I've shown him, Claire interrupted. Weeks of evidence, documentation. Your suspicious behavior, the missing pieces, the secret bank account. What secret bank account? But Claire was already heading downstairs to meet her son, her silk robe flowing behind her like a victor's cape. I heard the front door open, followed by urgent whispers. My phone buzzed one final time. Don't come downstairs. Don't touch anything. I've called the police. I sank back onto the bed, my investigator's mind already cataloging every detail, every inconsistency in Claire's setup. She was good. I'd give her that. But she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd chosen the wrong person to frame. Because while she'd been busy planting evidence, I'd been unconsciously gathering my own. And I knew exactly how to prove my innocence. Just had to survive what was coming first. Heavy footsteps on the stairs. Claire's voice, sickly sweet. She's up there, darling. Remember what the police said. Don't let her leave until they arrive. The bedroom door swung open. David stood in the doorway, his hospital scrubs still on, his dark hair disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. The man I'd fallen in love with during my guest lecture on financial crimes at Portland Medical School looked like a stranger now. His warm brown eyes, usually so full of compassion, were cold and distant. Where are they, Sarah? His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried an edge I'd never heard before. I stayed seated on the bed, my hands visible in my lap, an instinct from years of dealing with volatile situations. You know me better than this, David. Think about what you're asking. Think about who I am. I thought I knew who you were. He pulled out his phone, swiping through what I assumed were Claire's carefully staged photos. 6 pieces, Sarah. 6 family heirlooms, disappearing over 3 months. My grandmother's emerald earrings, my great-aunt's pearl necklace, the ruby bracelet that's been in our family for 4 generations. All coincidentally after your mother moved in, I said, keeping my voice steady. Have you wondered why they started disappearing only after she arrived? Claire appeared behind him, her hand resting possessively on his shoulder. Don't let her manipulate you, darling. Remember what Dr. Harrison said about sociopaths in positions of authority? How they're expert manipulators. My laugh was sharp and bitter. You got my own therapist involved in this? When? 2 weeks ago, David replied, his jaw tense. After Mom found the first transfer to your secret account. What secret account? I stood up slowly, my investigator's instincts firing on all cylinders. David, I don't have any secret accounts. Every penny I earn goes into our joint account, or my retirement fund, which you have full access to. Then explain this. He thrust his phone toward me. On the screen was a banking app showing transfers from our joint account to something called SKW Holdings, a series of small transactions adding up to exactly the appraised value of the missing jewelry. I felt the blood drain from my face. SKW Holdings, the same initials as my full name, Sarah Catherine Winters. It was clever. I had to give Claire that. She'd done her homework. I've never seen this account before, I said, my mind racing. But I can prove it's not mine. Banking transactions leave digital fingerprints, IP addresses, device IDs, authentication logs. I can show you. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The police will handle the investigation, David interrupted. His voice cracked slightly. They're on their way. They'll search the house, check all accounts, all transactions. Perfect, I said, surprising both of them with my vehemence. Let them come. Let them investigate, because whoever set up that account made one critical mistake. They didn't know about my specialty at the firm. Claire's perfectly manicured hand tightened on David's shoulder. What specialty? I smiled for the first time since this nightmare began. Digital forensics. I don't just investigate fraud, Claire. I track it through the digital wilderness. Every login, every transfer, every account creation leaves traces. Traces that can't be erased. Not even by someone as meticulous as you. Something flickered in David's eyes. Doubt, maybe. Or a glimmer of the trust we'd built over 6 years together. But Claire was ready. She's desperate, she hissed. Can't you see? She's trying to buy time to destroy evidence. The police said not to let her near any devices. As if on cue, sirens wailed in the distance. David's face hardened again. Your work laptop is already secured downstairs. Your phone, please. David. Your phone, Sarah. Now. I could refuse. Could point out that without my phone, I'd have no way to prove my innocence. Could remind him of every moment we'd shared. Every promise we'd made. But I saw something in his stance that stopped me. Fear. Not of me, but of being wrong. About his mother. About me. About everything. Slowly, I pulled my phone from my pocket. But before handing it over, I pressed my thumb to the fingerprint sensor and opened my photos. One thing first, I said, turning the screen toward them. Look at this. The photo was from 2 weeks ago. Claire in my closet at 3 a.m. clearly, unaware of the motion-activated camera I'd installed after noticing things being moved. In her hands was my jewelry box. David's sharp intake of breath was audible. Claire's reaction was faster. She snatched the phone from my hands with surprising strength. Manufactured evidence, she said quickly. Doctored timestamps. She's trying to frame me, David, just like I warned you she might. But the seed of doubt was planted. I could see it in the way David's shoulders tensed, in how his eyes darted between his mother and me. The sirens were getting closer. The truth will come out, I said quietly, speaking to David alone. Digital evidence doesn't lie. People do. Enough. Claire's composed facade cracked slightly. David, remember what she is, a professional fraud investigator. She knows every trick, every way to manipulate evidence. Don't let her confuse you. The first police car pulled into our driveway, lights flashing against the morning sun. David straightened his shoulders, doctor mode engaging. Crisis now, emotions later. Just stay here until they finish their search, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. As they left the room, I heard Claire's voice, soft but carrying. It's not your fault, darling. Some people just hide their true nature very, very well. I sat back down on the bed, my mind already racing through digital timestamps, login records, and authentication logs. Claire had played her hand well, but she'd overlooked something crucial. In the digital age, every action leaves a trace. The front door opened downstairs. Heavy footsteps, official voices. I closed my eyes, centered myself, and prepared for the biggest investigation of my career, proving my own innocence. The game was on. The next hour unfolded like a surreal play where I was both actor and audience. From my bedroom prison, I listened to the methodical sounds of the police search below. Drawers opening, cabinets closing, the occasional murmur of professional voices. Every so often, Claire's carefully modulated tones would rise above the general noise, directing attention to yet another suspicious area. Oh, and officers, you might want to check behind the loose panel in her home office. I noticed her spending a lot of time there late at night. Of course she had. The loose panel where I kept our property documents, including the deed to our house, which I'd bought before marriage with my own savings. I closed my eyes, adding another piece to the puzzle. This wasn't just about David's trust fund anymore. Claire was after everything. A sharp knock on the bedroom door made me open my eyes. Detective Lisa Chen entered, her badge glinting under the morning light. Behind her, I could see David hovering uncertainly in the hallway before Claire smoothly pulled him away. "Mrs. Winters," Detective Chen said, closing the door. "I understand you're a fraud investigator at Rainier Securities?" "Senior digital forensics specialist," I corrected, watching her reaction carefully. "I specialize in tracing complex financial fraud through digital footprints." Something flickered in her dark eyes. Interest, maybe even a hint of professional respect. "Then you understand the seriousness of these allegations. 6 pieces of family jewelry, valued at approximately $487,000, missing over 3 months. Multiple suspicious transfers to a shell company sharing your initials." I leaned forward. "Detective, I'd like to show you something, may I?" I gestured to her department-issued tablet. She hesitated, then handed it over. I quickly navigated to the Oregon Business Registry, SKW Holdings, I said, pulling up the company details. "Registered 3 months ago, exactly 2 days after Claire moved in. Look at the filing attorney." Detective Chen peered at the screen. "Margaret Wu? Claire's best friend from college. They still play tennis every Wednesday at Riverside Club. Check the notary stamp on page 2. The detective scrolled down, her eyebrows rising slightly. "Stamped in Beaverton. Where Claire lived before moving in with us. Quite a coincidence, don't you think?" Before she could respond, rapid footsteps approached. The door burst open and one of the junior officers rushed in. "Detective Chen, we found something." My heart sank as I saw what he was carrying. My old laptop, the one I'd stored in the garage. I'd meant to destroy it properly, but work had been chaos lately. Claire appeared behind the officer, her face a mask of concerned triumph. "That was hidden behind some boxes in the garage," she said. I remembered seeing Sarah taking something out there late one night. Detective Chen took the laptop. "Is this yours, Mrs. Winters?" I nodded slowly. "It's my old work laptop. I haven't used it in months." "Mind if we take a look?" "I'd rather you didn't." The words were out before I could stop them. Claire's smile widened fractionally. Detective Chen's expression hardened. "Mrs. Winters, are you refusing to cooperate?" "No," I said quickly. "I'm warning you. That laptop was used to investigate a major cryptocurrency fraud last year. It contains sensitive client information protected by attorney-client privilege. You'll need a specific warrant to access it." "Or," Claire interjected smoothly, "it contains evidence of her own crimes. David told me she's been obsessed with cryptocurrency lately. All those late nights researching. Maybe she was learning how to hide money." I turned to face her fully. "Like you did with Robert's money during your divorce, Claire? Is that why you're so familiar with the concept?" The color drained from Claire's face. Behind her, David appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "That's enough," Detective Chen said firmly. "Mrs. Winters will get the warrant. In the meantime..." She paused as her phone buzzed. Reading the message, her expression changed. "The forensics team found something in your home office. Would you care to explain why there's a false bottom in your desk drawer?" My blood ran cold. I had no false bottom in my desk drawer. "That's impossible," I said, standing up. "I want to see this myself." "Stay here," Detective Chen ordered. "Officer Brady will remain with you." As they left, Claire lingered in the doorway. For a moment, her mask slipped, and I saw raw hatred in her eyes. "You should have just played along, Sarah," she said softly. "Now I'll have to use everything." The implications of that statement hit me just as my phone, still in her possession, chimed with an incoming email. Claire glanced at it, and her smile turned predatory. "Oh my," she said. "It seems your firm's IT department has some concerns about unusual access to client files from your work computer. How unfortunate." She left before I could respond, closing the door with a soft click that felt like a vault sealing shut. Officer Brady shifted uncomfortably by the window as I paced the room, my mind racing. Claire hadn't just been setting me up for theft. She'd been laying the groundwork for something much bigger. The false drawer bottom, the old laptop, the timing of the IT department's email. She was trying to destroy not just my marriage, but my entire career. Through the floor, I could hear the muffled sounds of the forensics team in my office. Drawers opening, floorboards creaking, the soft beep of electronic equipment. They wouldn't find any stolen jewelry, but what would they find? What else had Claire planted while I was at work? My gaze fell on the closet where this nightmare had started. The jasmine incense still burned, but underneath it, I caught another scent, something chemical and sharp. The adhesive Claire had, used to tamper with the jewelry box? No. Something else. Something that triggered a memory from a case last year. Suddenly, I knew what Claire meant by everything. "Officer Brady," I said urgently, "I need to speak to Detective Chen right now. Livs may be at risk." He looked skeptical. "She's busy with the search." "Then get David, please. His mother isn't just framing me. She's setting up something much worse." But it was too late. From downstairs came the sound of breaking glass, followed by Claire's practiced scream of alarm. The game had just changed dramatically, and I was the only one who knew the real rules. The sound of breaking glass was followed by chaos. Officer Brady rushed from the room, his hand on his weapon, leaving me alone for the first time since this nightmare began. Through the open door, I heard Claire's voice, rising in perfectly modulated hysteria. "The safe. She's gotten to the safe. Somehow, all our documents, our backup drives, everything's gone." My heart stopped. The safe in David's home office, where we kept all our important papers, including the evidence from my biggest cases. Cases that could prove exactly how Claire had managed to hide money during her divorce. I moved without thinking, running down the hallway toward David's office. No one tried to stop me. They were all focused on Claire, who had positioned herself at the perfect angle to block the doorway while appearing to be in distress. "Oh, God," she was saying, one manicured hand pressed to her chest. "The jewelry. It must have been in here, too. She must have taken it when she accessed the safe." I pushed past her into the office, and my blood ran cold. The wall safe was open, smoke curling from its interior. The acrid smell of burned electronics filled the air. On the floor, shattered glass from a broken whiskey decanter mingled with the ashes of what had once been paper documents. Detective Chen knelt by the safe, examining the damage. "Chemical fire," she said grimly. "Targeted, destroyed everything inside." "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." David appeared beside me, his face ashen. "The backup drives?" "Melted," Detective Chen confirmed. "Professionally done. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." Claire's gasp was theatrical. "Sarah, all those nights you spent in here claiming to be working late, you were planning this all along?" I spun to face her. "You did this. You somehow triggered that fire remotely. Just like you set up the false drawer bottom, just like you created." "SKW Holdings, Mrs. Winters," Detective Chen's voice was sharp. "You just admitted to knowing about the company." "Because I found it in the business registry. I was trying to show you—" "A company sharing your initials," Claire interrupted smoothly. "Registered in Beaverton where you lived before marrying David, using a lawyer you knew from your firm's client list." My mind raced. Margaret Wu, of course. She hadn't just been Claire's college friend. She'd been involved in one of my investigations last year, an investigation whose evidence had just gone up in smoke. David, I said, turning to my husband. Remember last October, the Wu case? I told you about finding irregular patterns in offshore accounts. Accounts that linked back to my mother's divorce? David's voice was quiet. Is that what you're suggesting? Check your phone, I said desperately. The photos I showed you earlier are gone, Claire cut in, along with everything else on her phone. How convenient. Detective Chen straightened up. Mrs. Winters, facing the evidence we've gathered, the transfers, the hidden compartments, and now this destruction of potential evidence, I have no choice. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back. Wait! I stepped back, my mind racing. The chemical fire. It's the same compound used in the Preston bankruptcy case last year. A specific mixture that leaves a distinct residue. Test it, please. You'll find traces of Sarah. David's voice stopped me. He looked broken, defeated. Just stop, please. Claire moved to his side, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. Her eyes met mine over his bowed head, and in them I saw something that chilled me to my core. Not just triumph, but absolute certainty. She had planned this moment down to the smallest detail. As Detective Chen began reading my rights, I noticed something odd. The smoke from the safe was behaving strangely, curling in patterns that didn't match natural airflow. Almost as if the ventilation system, I whispered, then louder. Detective, the fire's not out. It's spreading through the ventilation system. Claire's eyes widened fractionally, the first genuine reaction I'd seen from her. Detective Chen paused, looking up at the ceiling vent where smoke was indeed beginning to seep through. Everyone out, she ordered. Now, call fire dispatch. We evacuated quickly, spilling onto the front lawn as sirens wailed in the distance. I watched in helpless rage as flames began to lick at the windows of my home office, where I kept my personal laptop, my paper files, everything that could prove my innocence. Claire stood with David near the street, playing the part of the sigh. Distraught mother perfectly. But I saw her slip something into her pocket, something small and metallic that caught the morning sun. A remote trigger. She hadn't just framed me for theft. She had destroyed every piece of evidence I had against her and made it look like I had done it myself. And now, as the fire truck screamed up our street, she would play her final card. Detective, she called out, her voice trembling. I just remembered. Sarah was asking about our insurance policy last week, about how much the house was worth. I laughed then, a sharp, bitter sound that made everyone turn to stare. Really? Claire? Insurance fraud too? Why not add domestic terrorism while you're at it? But I could see in Detective Chen's eyes that the damage was done. Every word I spoke now would only dig my hole deeper. As the firefighters rushed past us, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in their truck's polished surface. I looked wild, desperate, exactly how Claire wanted me to look. The perfect picture of a cornered criminal, the handcuffs closed around my wrists with a final click. Sarah Winters, Detective Chen said formally, you're under arrest for grand theft, fraud, destruction of evidence, and suspected arson. You have the right to remain silent. The last thing I saw as they led me to the police car was Claire, holding David close as they watched their handiwork burn. But she had made one crucial mistake in her perfect plan. She hadn't destroyed everything. Because some evidence isn't stored in safes or on hard drives, some evidence is stored in the cloud. The holding cell at Portland Central Precinct was exactly what you'd expect. Cold, sterile, and designed to break your spirit. I sat on the metal bench, my business suit now wrinkled and smelling of smoke, and forced myself to think like an investigator rather than a victim. Fact 1. Claire had orchestrated a complex frame-up involving digital forgery, physical evidence tampering, and calculated destruction of evidence. Fact 2. She'd needed help. Margaret Wu wasn't just a convenient name to drop. She was a connection. Fact 3. The fire wasn't random. It had targeted specific areas of the house where I kept records. Winters. A guard appeared at the cell door. "Your lawyer's here." I looked up, expecting to see the public defender I'd been promised. Instead, Marcus Jang stood there, his immaculate suit a stark contrast to the institutional gray walls. Marcus? I hadn't seen my former colleague since he'd left Rainier Securities to start his own practice last year. "How did you—" Rachel called me. He pulled up a chair as the guard led him into the cell. "Your assistant at Rainier?" She saw the arrest report hit the system and knew something was wrong. "Said you'd been acting strange ever since your mother-in-law moved in." Relief flooded through me. Rachel. Of course. She'd been helping me document Claire's odd behavior over the past 3 months. "They're charging you with multiple felonies," Marcus said, opening his briefcase. "Theft, fraud, evidence tampering, and they're pushing for arson. But there are inconsistencies in their case. Big ones." I leaned forward. "The SKW Holdings transfers. They came from an IP address that would have been logged already on it. But Sarah..." He hesitated. "Your entire home network was wiped in the fire. All your personal devices are either destroyed or in evidence lockup, and your cloud accounts were accessed and purged remotely an hour ago." My mind raced. What about the Rainier Securities servers? My work files? Compromised. Someone used your credentials to access them this morning, then triggered a security protocol that locked everything down. The IT department is treating it as a potential data breach. Claire had thought of everything, not just framing me for theft, but destroying my reputation, my career, my entire life. But she'd made one mistake. "Marcus," I said slowly, "what do you remember about the Wu bankruptcy case last year?" He frowned. "Messy situation. Offshore accounts. Hidden assets. You found a pattern in their..." His eyes widened. "Their transfer protocols." "Exactly. The same pattern I spotted in Claire's divorce records." I lowered my voice. "Records that were stored on the NASDAQ monitoring system because they involved publicly traded companies." "Which can't be altered or deleted," Marcus finished, already pulling out his phone. "But Sarah, accessing those records would require a federal warrant, I know, but it would prove that Claire and Margaret Wu worked together before. That they had a system for hiding assets." I started pacing the small cell. "The chemical fire in our safe? It's the same compound that was used to destroy evidence in the Wu case. Check the lab reports. They'll be on file with the FBI." Marcus was typing rapidly. "That's circumstantial at best. We need more." Rachel has been keeping a log of everything Claire's done since she moved in. Times, dates, witnesses, and she backs up everything to her personal server, which would be admissible. "Because she's a third party." Marcus looked up. "But why? Why would Claire go to these lengths?" I stopped pacing. "Because of what I found during the Wu investigation. It wasn't just about hidden assets. They were moving money through a network of shell companies, all registered, to different people but following the same pattern. And one of those patterns led back to a series of accounts opened in Beaverton 3 months before Claire's divorce." Understanding dawned in Marcus's eyes. "She's not just framing you for theft. She's covering her tracks. The jewelry, the fake transfers, the fire. It's all misdirection. She needed to destroy evidence that could prove she committed perjury during her divorce. Evidence that could send her to federal prison. And implicate Margaret Wu in the process." Marcus was already dialing. "I'm calling in some favors at the SEC. If we can get those NASDAQ records." The cell door opened again. Detective Chen stood there, her expression unreadable. "Mrs. Winters, ready to make a statement?" I glanced at Marcus, who nodded slightly. "Actually," I said, standing up, "I'd like to tell you about a federal financial crimes investigation from last year. one involving Margaret Wu, Claire Andrews, and a very specific pattern of offshore transfers. Detective Chen's eyebrows rose fractionally. I'm listening. First, I said, I need you to pull the FBI lab reports from the Wu bankruptcy case. Pay special attention to the chemical analysis of a fire that destroyed their records. Then compare it to the residue from my safe. And, Marcus added, we need to talk about a series of NASDAQ transactions that suggest a much bigger conspiracy. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the balance of power shift. Claire thought she had destroyed all the evidence, but she hadn't counted on the one thing I knew better than anyone. In the digital age, nothing is ever truly gone. As I began laying out the complex web of financial transactions and shell companies that would expose Claire's true motives, I thought about David. He would learn the truth soon enough. But first, I had to make sure there was enough evidence to bring down not just Claire, but the entire network she'd built. The game wasn't over. It was just moving to a bigger board. The next 48 hours transformed the Portland Central Precinct's interview room into command central for what was rapidly becoming a major financial crimes investigation. Detective Chen had cleared the walls, which were now covered with printouts of transaction records, corporate filings, and a complex web of relationships centered around Claire and Margaret Wu. Walk me through this again, Detective Chen said, cradling her fourth coffee of the day. These shell companies, I pointed to a cluster of documents on the left wall, all registered within 3 months of each other. Different names, different addresses, but all following the same pattern. Look at the incorporation dates. Marcus, who hadn't left my side since becoming my lawyer, stepped forward. The first one was registered 2 days after Sarah started investigating Wu Enterprises. Each subsequent company was formed exactly 7 days apart? Like a cascade, I explained. Each new company created just in time to receive transfers from the previous one. By the time anyone could trace the money, it had already moved through 3 or 4 different entities. Detective Chen frowned at the timeline. And you think Claire was warning Wu about the investigation? I know she was. I pulled up a calendar on my phone, a backup device Marcus had brought me. Every Wednesday, Claire and Margaret Wu played tennis at Riverside Club. The same day, each new company was registered. That's circumstantial, Detective Chen pointed. Out. But this isn't. Rachel burst into the room, her usually pristine assistant's appearance disheveled from what I assumed was an all-nighter at the office. She slapped a thick folder on the table. I found it in the backup archives at Rainier Securities. Someone tried to delete it this morning, but they didn't know about our offline storage. I opened the folder and felt my heart jump. Staring up, at me was a photo of Claire and Margaret Wu having lunch at the Heathman Hotel on the exact day I had presented my initial findings about Wu Enterprises to the SEC. There's more, Rachel said, spreading out more photos. I've been documenting everything since Claire moved in. Not just her behavior at the house, but her meetings, her phone calls, everything. I knew something was off when she kept asking about Sarah's cases. Detective Chen leaned forward. Why were you keeping such detailed records? Rachel straightened her glasses. Because 3 months ago, Sarah asked me to help her track some irregularities she'd noticed in the Wu case. Transactions that didn't make sense until we looked at Claire's divorce records. A new voice joined the conversation. Records that show a very interesting pattern of asset distribution. We all turned to see Special Agent Diana Torres from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit standing in the doorway, holding a thick manila envelope. The chemical residue from your safe? She continued, walking in. Perfect match to the accelerant used in the Wu bankruptcy case. But more importantly, we found this in the NASDAQ monitoring archives. She spread out a series of transaction records. Even from across the room, I could see the pattern. The same one I'd discovered in the Wu investigation. These transfers, Agent Torres pointed to a sequence of numbers, were routed through accounts registered to shell companies in Beaverton. all opened within weeks of Claire Andrews filing for divorce. Using the same protocol Wu Enterprises used to hide assets during bankruptcy, I added. Claire wasn't just hiding money from her divorce settlement. She was testing Wu's system, making sure it worked before they expanded their operation. Marcus whistled softly. How much are we talking about? Conservative estimate? Agent Torres raised an eyebrow. 47 million across all identified accounts. And that's just what we can trace so far. Detective Chen was already reaching for her phone. We need to move on this now. If Claire realizes we've made these connections... Actually, Rachel interrupted, holding up her tablet. We might have a bigger problem. Sarah, you need to see this. I took the tablet and felt my blood run cold. On the screen was an email from David, sent to the hospital board of directors. He was resigning his position, effective immediately, and transferring his practice privileges to a hospital in Vancouver. He's running, I whispered. Claire's convinced him to flee. Not just him, Agent Torres said grimly. We just got alerts that Margaret Wu's passport was used at SeaTac Airport an hour ago. Private flight to the Cayman Islands. The room erupted into action. Detective Chen was barking orders into her phone. Agent Torres was coordinating with FBI field teams, and Marcus was already drafting emergency injunctions to freeze assets. But I stood still, staring at David's email. After everything, the false accusations, the destroyed evidence, the elaborate frame-up, Claire's final move was to take my husband away completely. Sarah. Rachel's voice was gentle but urgent. What do you want to do? I looked around, the room at the evidence we'd gathered, the proof of Claire's elaborate conspiracy. Then I looked back at David's email, at the words that showed how completely his mother had poisoned his trust in me. We move now, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. All of it. Every shell company, every hidden account, every connection between Claire and Wu. But first, I turned to Agent Torres. How fast can you get a team to Vancouver? She smiled grimly. Already on it, but you know if we bring him in, he'll be considered an accessory. I know. The words tasted bitter. But better he faces the truth now than lives with his mother's lies forever. Rachel squeezed my arm. What about Claire? I looked at the photo of her and Wu at the Heathman Hotel, their smug faces frozen in time as they plotted to destroy lives for profit. Claire thinks she's won, I said. Let's show her what a real financial crimes investigation looks like. Detective Chen nodded approvingly. Where do we start? The tennis club, I said, already reaching for my coat. Wednesday morning league starts in 30 minutes, and I bet Claire won't want to miss her weekly game with Margaret Wu, even if her partner's already fled the country. As we mobilized to move, I caught my reflection in the window. I didn't see a victim anymore. I saw an investigator, a professional, a woman who had spent years learning how to unravel complex financial frauds. Claire had tried to destroy my life using money and lies. Now I would use the truth to destroy her carefully constructed world of deception. The real game was just beginning. The Riverside Tennis Club's pristine courts seemed surreal in the morning light. I sat in Detective Chen's unmarked car, watching through binoculars as Claire arrived in her Mercedes, tennis whites impeccable as always. She moved with the confidence of someone who thought they'd won, someone who had no idea their world was about to implode. Target is on court 3, Agent Torres's voice crackled through our earpieces. No sign of distress. She doesn't know about Wu. I adjusted my blazer, making sure my visitor's badge was visible. How many exits? 4, Detective Chen replied. All covered. But remember, we're not here to arrest her yet. We need her to access those accounts. I nodded, checking my phone one last time. Rachel had set up a sophisticated tracking system that would monitor any attempts to access the shell company's accounts. The moment Claire tried to move money or contact Wu, we'd have her. Movement at the club entrance. Marcus reported from his position near the pro shop. "You're not going to believe who just showed up." I turned my binoculars toward the entrance and felt my breath catch. David stood there, looking lost in his casual clothes, so different from his usual surgical scrubs. He hadn't fled to Vancouver. After all, this changes things, Detective Chen said quietly. If he warns her, he won't, I interrupted. Look at his body language. He's not here to warn her. He's here for answers. We watched as David made his way toward Court 3. Claire spotted him, and her perfect mask slipped for just a moment, surprise and something like fear crossing her features before she recovered. "Now," I said, opening the car door, "before she can spin another lie." Walking across the parking lot toward the courts, I felt strangely calm. The evidence was solid, the trap was set, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I had the upper hand? "David," Claire's voice carried across the morning air, syrupy sweet with underlying panic. "Darling, what are you doing here? I thought you were looking at the divorce records." David cut her off. "The ones from your split with Dad. The ones Sarah was investigating before all this started." I reached the court just as Claire's tennis racket clattered to the ground. Her eyes darted between David and me, calculating her next move. "Whatever she's told you," Claire began, "it's all part of her manipulation. The evidence is right. Here," I said, holding up my tablet. "Every transfer, every shell company, every Wednesday tennis game with Margaret Wu. Did you really think I wouldn't keep backups of my investigation files, Claire? That I wouldn't recognize the same money-hiding schemes you helped Wu perfect?" Claire's composure cracked. "You have no proof." "Actually," David said, his voice heavy with betrayal, "she has everything. The hospital board received an anonymous package this morning. Full documentation of your involvement in the Wu bankruptcy fraud. That's why I'm here instead of Vancouver." "The Vancouver transfer was never real, was it?" I asked, watching Claire's face. "Just another false trail, like the jewelry theft, like SKW Holdings. You needed everyone looking the wrong way while you and Wu moved the real money." $47 million, David added. "That's what you helped her hide, what you were hiding from Dad during your divorce. How much was your cut, Mom?" Claire's eyes darted toward the parking lot. I could almost see her calculating the distance to her car. "Don't," I said quietly. "FBI teams are covering every exit. Wu's already in custody. They caught her at a private airfield in the Caymans an hour ago. It's over." "Nothing's over," Claire snarled, her cultured accent slipping. "You think you're so clever, Sarah? You have no idea what you're dealing with. Those accounts, those companies, they're just the surface. There are things even your precious investigation hasn't uncovered." "You mean like the offshore trust in Singapore?" I pulled up another document on my tablet. "The one you set up for David's inheritance? I found that too. Along with the clause that would transfer everything to you if he divorced me. David's sharp intake of breath told me he hadn't known about that part." "Mom?" His voice cracked. "Is that true?" "I was protecting you," Claire insisted, reaching for him. "She's a gold digger, David. Everything she does is about money. Why do you think she specializes in financial crimes?" "She made her own fortune before we ever met," David finished. "Bought our house with cash from her consulting work. Never touched my trust fund." He looked at her with new eyes. "This was never about protecting me, was it? This was about control, about money, about your own greed." Claire's hand dropped. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, a statue in tennis whites. Then she smiled, a cold, calculating expression that transformed her entire face. "You want to talk about greed?" She pulled out her phone. "Let's talk about what really happened to Wu's client's money. Because if I'm going down, I'm not going alone." Before any of us could move, her fingers flew across the screen. Alarms blared from my tablet, dozens of transfers initiating simultaneously across multiple accounts. "Claire Andrews, Agent Torres's voice rang out as FBI agents emerged. From every corner of the tennis club, step away from the phone. You're under arrest for financial fraud, conspiracy, and attempted evidence tampering. But Claire was laughing. You're too late. The dead man switch is activated. In 30 seconds, every account will empty into a cascade of transfers even. Your best investigators can't track, unless what? David asked. Unless Sarah drops all charges, destroys all evidence, admits to everything she accused me of. Claire's eyes gleamed. Tick-tock, dear daughter-in-law. What's worth more, your reputation or $47 million in client funds? I looked at my tablet, watching the transfer protocols initiate. Then I smiled. You really should have paid more attention to who designed Wu's transfer systems, I said quietly. Check your phone, Claire. The signal's not going through. Claire's triumphant expression faltered as she stared at her screen. What did you do? Nothing, I replied. Just let you activate exactly the evidence we needed. Proof that you had access to and control over Wu's illegal accounts. Rachel, did you get all that? Every keystroke, Rachel's voice came through the earpiece. Plus the dead man switch protocols. The SEC is going to love this. As Agent Torres moved in with handcuffs, Claire finally lost her perfect composure. This isn't possible, she hissed. I destroyed everything. The safe, the files, your reputation. You destroyed papers, I corrected her. But you forgot what I actually do for a living. I don't just investigate financial crimes, Claire. I build the systems that catch people like you. David stepped forward, placing himself between his mother and me. Goodbye, Mom. I hope it was worth it. As the FBI led Claire away, her tennis whites stark against the black SUVs, I felt David's hand slip into mine. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should have trusted you. I squeezed his hand but didn't respond. Trust, like financial systems, was something that had to be rebuilt carefully, systematically, with proper safeguards in place. We had time for that later. Right now, I had $47 million to trace and return to its rightful owners. And, somewhere in a Cayman Islands holding cell, Margaret Wu was about to learn just how thoroughly her former tennis partner had sold her out. The SEC's Seattle office hummed with activity even at 7 p.m. I sat in Conference Room B, surrounded by mountains of financial data, while Agent Torres and the forensic accounting team pieced together Claire and Wu's elaborate fraud scheme. Another shell company just surfaced, Rachel announced, adding a yellow pin to our digital map. Grand Cayman, registered to a subsidiary of Wu Enterprises. I studied the complex web of transactions displayed on the wall screen. Look at the timing. Every major transfer coincides with Claire's tennis matches. Not just tennis, David said, quietly from his corner. He'd insisted on being here, on understanding the full scope of his mother's deception. Book club meetings, charity galas, garden society luncheons. She used her entire social network to facilitate this. Agent Torres nodded grimly. We've identified at least 12 other socialites involved in the scheme, all wealthy divorcees, all with connections to Wu's legitimate business interests. And all with access to their ex-husband's financial information, I added, pulling up a new data set. Claire wasn't just hiding her own assets, she was helping other women hide theirs, too, using Wu's infrastructure. Marcus burst into the room, his usual composed demeanor crackling with excitement. You need to see this. Wu's talking. He slapped a transcript on the table. I scanned it quickly, my eyes widening. Singapore, I breathed. The money's in Singapore. Not just the money, Marcus said. Everything. Client lists, transfer protocols, blackmail material. Wu kept records of every transaction, every conversation, including her meetings with Claire. David finished, standing up. Where? United Overseas Bank, Central Singapore. Private vault registered to a holding company called Azure. Horizons. I froze. Azure Horizons? Are you sure? Rachel was already typing. Found it. Registered 3 years ago. Primary shareholder listed as... Oh my God. What? Agent Torres demanded. It's me. I turned the screen so everyone could see. The company's registered in my name. Claire must have set it up using stolen identity documents. David swore softly. That's why she was so confident. Even if we caught her, the evidence would implicate you. We need to move fast, Agent Torres said, reaching for her phone. If word gets back to Claire that Wu's talking... Too late, Rachel interrupted, holding up her tablet. Claire's lawyer just filed a motion claiming all the Singapore assets belong to Sarah. They're painting this as a sophisticated frame-up. By me. The room fell silent. Everything we'd uncovered, everything we'd proven, could be undermined. By this single piece of Claire's long game. Options? Agent Torres asked. Marcus straightened his tie. We could try to prove identity theft, but it would take months. Singapore's banking privacy laws... No, I cut him off. An idea forming. We don't fight the company registration. We use it. David frowned. What do you mean? If Azure Horizons is legally mine, then I have access to that vault, to everything Wu stored there. I turned to Agent Torres. How fast can you get me to Singapore? Sarah, no. David protested. It's too dangerous. If anything goes wrong. Then I'm exactly where Claire wants me, implicated in international financial fraud. I met his eyes. But if it works, we get everything. The complete record of her crimes, her network, her victims. Agent Torres was already on her phone. I can have a team ready in 3 hours. But Sarah, you understand the risks? If Claire has other contingencies in place... She does, I said confidently. She always does. But she made one crucial mistake. What's that? Rachel asked. I smiled grimly. She used my name, my identity, which means legally I can access not just the vault, but all of Azure Horizons' other holdings. Including what? David pressed. I pulled up the company's filing documents. Including its Singapore telecommunications subsidiary, the one that handles secure communications for private banking clients. Understanding dawned on Agent Torres's face. You can monitor their communications, track who Claire contacts when she learns about this. Better, I said, already reaching for my laptop. I can use their own secure system to document everything. Every call, every message, every attempt to hide evidence becomes proof of conspiracy. It's elegant, Marcus admitted, but also incredibly risky. If you're caught accessing those systems, then I go to prison, I finished. But if I don't try, Claire's plan works anyway. She's already filed documents claiming I'm behind everything. This way, we at least have a chance to expose the truth. David moved to stand beside me, his hand finding mine under the table. You're not doing this alone. Actually, I squeezed his hand but kept my eyes on Agent Torres. I am. You need to stay here, stay visible. If Claire's watching, she needs to think you've abandoned me, that her plan to drive us apart worked. She'll never believe I'd turn against you, not after everything we've uncovered. She will if you file for divorce. The room went still. Rachel gasped softly. Absolutely not, David said firmly. Think about it, I pressed. Claire's entire plan revolves around separating us, gaining control of your inheritance. If she believes it worked, she'll get sloppy, Agent Torres finished. Start moving assets, contacting co-conspirators. And we'll be recording all of it, I added. Marcus was already pulling out papers. We can file under seal, make it look real while protecting your actual marriage. David stared at me for a long moment. How are you so calm about this? Because I know who I'm dealing with now. I stood up, addressing the whole room. Claire thinks she's won because she's playing chess, moving pieces, sacrificing pawns, thinking 10 moves ahead. But she forgot something important. What's that? Rachel asked. I don't play chess. I pulled up Azure Horizon's secure communications platform. I build the systems that catch people who think they're too clever to get caught. And it's time to show Claire exactly what those systems can do. Agent Torres nodded approvingly. When do we leave? As soon as David files for divorce, I said, trying to ignore the pain those words caused. And as soon as we set up one more thing. What? I smiled, thinking of Claire in her prison cell, so confident in her perfect plan. A press conference, where my heartbroken soon-to-be ex-husband announces he's cooperating with the FBI investigation into his wife's international financial crimes. She'll never believe I'd do that, David protested. She will, I said softly, because you're her son, and she taught you how to betray the people you love. As the team mobilized around us, I caught David's eye. In that look, we made a silent promise. Claire had tried to destroy our marriage with lies. We would save it with a performance worthy of her own manipulative playbook. The game was changing, and this time, I was writing the rules. Singapore's United Overseas Bank gleamed like a crystal fortress in the morning sun. I adjusted my Hermes scarf, borrowed from the FBI's prop department, and checked my reflection in the mirrored walls. 2 days of careful preparation had transformed me from a disgraced financial investigator into the perfect image of a privileged fraudster. Designer suit, subtle jewelry, and the entitled attitude Claire had always accused me of hiding. Target is moving, Agent Torres's voice murmured through my nearly invisible earpiece. Claire's lawyer just filed an emergency motion to block your access to Azure Horizon's accounts. Too late, I whispered back, striding through the bank's ornate doors. Once we're in the system, Mrs. Winters, a sleek young banker, appeared at my elbow. I'm Jason Chen, Private Client Services. We received your authentication codes this morning. Please follow me. I followed him through a maze of marble corridors, mentally mapping each turn. The vault would be 2 levels down, but first we had to establish my credentials, the ones Claire had so thoughtfully created in my name. Your office has been prepared, Jason said, opening a door to reveal a state-of-the-art private banking suite. Though I must admit, we were surprised to see activity on this account after so long. Markets change, I replied smoothly, setting my briefcase on the polished desk. Assets need realignment. He nodded knowingly. Of course. Mrs. Wu mentioned similar concerns during her last visit. I kept my expression neutral, even as my pulse quickened. Margaret's always had good instincts. When did you say she was last? Here? Just last week. She seemed quite interested in the new security protocols. He paused delicately. Particularly regarding remote access. Remote access. Of course. Claire and Wu hadn't just been hiding money. They'd been building a back door into the bank's systems. Speaking of protocols, I said, pulling out my tablet, I need to verify some transactions. Certainly. Your biometric data is already in our system. Just place your hand on the scanner. The moment my palm touched the cool surface, alarms blared throughout the building. Jason's pleasant expression vanished. Federal agents. Torres's voice rang out as her team burst through the doors. Everyone stay where you are, I smiled at Jason's shocked face. You really should have checked those authentication codes more carefully. The real Sarah Winters would have known Wu was never here last week. She's been in FBI custody for days. I don't understand, he stammered. No, said a familiar voice from the doorway. But I do. Claire stood there, immaculate in prison orange, flanked by FBI agents. Her eyes blazed with fury. Hello, Claire, I said calmly. Surprised to see me? You were supposed to be blocked from accessing the accounts, she spat. The lawyers filed exactly the motions you wanted them to, making a very public record of my apparent control over Azure Horizons. I gestured around the office, leading us right here, where we found evidence of systematic bank fraud, Agent Torres added. including falsified authentication codes, fake biometric data, and a very interesting remote access system. Claire's composure cracked slightly. You have no proof I was involved. Actually, I turned my tablet toward her. We do. You see, when you created Azure Horizons in my name, you needed my identity documents. Documents you photographed while staying in our house. Documents that embedded GPS data showing exactly where and when they were scanned. Inadmissible, Claire snapped. Any decent lawyer would love to explain why my fingerprints in the bank system don't match my actual fingerprints, I interrupted. Or why the company's registration documents were created using a printer registered to your old law firm. The same firm handling Margaret Wu's bankruptcy case. Claire's eyes darted around the room, looking for escape routes. Finding none, she straightened her shoulders. Impressive, she conceded. But you've overlooked one thing. The money's already gone. From the obvious accounts? Yes. I pulled up another screen, but not from the trust fund you set up for David, the one that would revert to you if we divorced. For the first time, real fear flickered across Claire's face. You see, I continued, when David filed for divorce, it triggered an automatic transfer protocol. One you designed to move everything into a series of offshore accounts we've been monitoring for the past 48 hours. Impossible, Claire whispered. Those transfers were encrypted. Using the same system Wu Enterprises used, the one I helped design security protocols for last year. I smiled grimly. Did you really think I wouldn't recognize my own work? Agent Torres stepped forward. Claire Andrews, you're under arrest for international banking fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. We've already seized the accounts in Singapore, Grand Cayman, and Switzerland. And David? Claire's voice cracked slightly. Does my son know you used him as bait? I know everything, Mom. David appeared in the doorway, his face set in lines of disappointment. The divorce papers were fake, he continued. Just like your concern for me, for our family. It was all about money, wasn't it? Always about money. Claire's mask finally shattered completely. I was protecting you. No, David said quietly. Sarah was protecting me, from you. As the agents led Claire away, I sank into the leather chair, behind the desk. David moved to stand beside me, his hand warm on my shoulder. You okay? He asked softly. I looked around the opulent office, at the evidence of Claire's elaborate deception. I was just thinking, all this, the fake companies, the stolen identities, the international banking fraud, it would have been easier just to be honest about the money during her divorce. Mom never did anything the easy way, David said with a sad smile. Speaking of which, he pulled out an envelope. The hospital board reviewed everything. Your position as financial security consultant is confirmed, with a formal apology for any doubt cast on your reputation. I took the envelope but didn't open it. And us? After all this? David crouched beside my chair, taking my hands in his. Claire tried to destroy our marriage because she couldn't control it. Because we were stronger together than she ever expected. That hasn't changed. Agent Torres cleared her throat from the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, but we need to process the rest of the evidence. The Singapore authorities want their bank back. I stood up, still holding David's hand. Let's go home. As we left the bank, I caught our reflection in those mirrored walls. No more disguises, no more pretense. Just two people who had faced an elaborate conspiracy and emerged stronger. Claire had tried to frame me as a fraudster. Instead, she'd only proven what I'd always known. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually comes to light, especially when you know exactly where to dig for it. The Portland FBI field office's forensic lab looked more like a tech startup than a government facility. 3 days after our return from Singapore, I sat surrounded by screens displaying financial data from Claire and Wu's seized devices. Each monitor told a different part of their story and implicated a different set of victims. We've identified 37 more affected families, Rachel reported, adding markers to our digital map. All clients of Wu Enterprises, all involved in high-asset divorces within the last 5 years. I studied the pattern emerging on the main screen. Look at the timing. Every major asset concealment coincides with the Garden Society meetings, David finished, approaching with fresh coffee. He'd taken leave from the hospital to help us untangle his mother's web of deception. Mom's president of the Portland Garden Society. They meet monthly at different members' homes. Agent Torres looked up from her laptop. Those meetings gave them perfect cover. Wealthy women gathering to discuss roses while actually orchestrating one of the largest divorce fraud schemes we've ever seen, Marcus interrupted, striding in with a thick folder. The Singapore records are finally decrypted. You're not going to believe this. He spread the documents across our conference table. Bank statements, transfer records, and something else. Photographs. Dozens of them, showing Claire at various social events, always perfectly posed, always with her iPad. She recorded everything, I realized, picking up one photo. Every conversation, every transaction, every secret shared over champagne and flower arrangements. Blackmail insurance, David said quietly, in case any of her friends ever turned on her. Rachel was already scanning the photos into our system. The metadata's intact, dates, times, GPS coordinates. She documented her own conspiracy. Not just hers, Agent Torres pointed out. Look at this. She pulled up a spreadsheet. Each Garden Society member paid a consultation fee to Azure Horizons, 5% of whatever assets they managed to hide during their divorces. I leaned forward. That's why she created the company in my name. If anything went wrong, all roads would lead back to you, Marcus nodded. While Claire collected millions in consulting fees through a network of legitimate-looking social clubs, a new alert flashed across my screen. Wu's attorney just filed. Another motion. They're claiming all the Singapore evidence was obtained illegally. Let them, Agent Torres smiled. We didn't just find evidence of divorce fraud. Those records show systematic tax evasion, money laundering, and international banking violations. This stopped being a local case the moment we found the offshore accounts. David picked up one of the Garden Society photos, studying his mother's smiling face. All these women, they trusted her, confided in her, and she was just using them to build her network. Not all of them, Rachel corrected, pulling up another data set. Some were active participants. Look at these email threads. They recruited other women, taught them how to hide assets, brought them into the scheme. I scrolled through the emails, recognition dawning. It's a pyramid scheme. Claire and Wu at the top, then the Garden Society board members, then their recruits. Each level paying fees up the chain. While the women at the bottom lost everything, Agent Torres added grimly. We've found at least 12 cases where Claire's clients ended up worse off than before they sought her help. Marcus was already drafting documents. This changes our approach. Instead of individual fraud charges, we can prove ongoing criminal enterprise, I finished. RICO charges. The Garden Society wasn't just a cover, it was a legitimate criminal organization. With my mother as its CEO, David said bitterly, using flowers and fundraisers to hide a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. A new message popped up on my screen from the Singapore Bank's internal investigation team. They found something in the vault, physical evidence Claire didn't have time to destroy. Agent Torres moved to look over my shoulder. What is it? Notebooks. Handwritten records of every meeting, every transaction, every secret shared. Claire may have been tech-savvy enough to encrypt her digital files. But she still kept paper backups, Rachel breathed. Old habits die hard. I turned to David. We need those notebooks. But there's a problem. They're in your mother's handwriting. To authenticate them. I'll have to testify. He nodded. Confirm it's her writing, her system of notation. I know. David, I said softly. This would mean publicly testifying against your mother. Once the media gets hold of this... He straightened his shoulders, looking so much like his old self, the brilliant surgeon who'd caught my eye at that guest lecture years ago. She didn't just commit fraud, Sarah. She tried to destroy you, us, everything we built. And she did. It to dozens of other families, too. Agent Torres's phone buzzed. Singapore authorities are ready to transfer the notebooks, but they want someone from the investigation team to accompany them. All eyes turned to me. No, David said immediately. It's too risky. Claire still has connections. Which is exactly why it needs to be me, I countered. I know her patterns, her codes, and more importantly, I know how she thinks. If there are any hidden messages in those notebooks, Marcus was already checking flight schedules. We can have you in Singapore by tomorrow morning. Full FBI protection. Team diplomatic courier status for the evidence. I looked at David, seeing the worry in his eyes. I'll be careful. This time, he said, managing a small smile, I'm coming with you. Mom's not the only one who can authenticate her handwriting. Rachel raised her hand. The Garden Society has another meeting scheduled for tomorrow. Several key members are planning to attend, despite everything that's happened. Perfect, Agent Torres said. While you two are securing the notebooks, we'll put the society under surveillance. See who's still actively involved in the scheme. I stood up, gathering my files. One more thing. Check the society's charitable foundation records. Claire never did anything without multiple layers of protection. I bet those fundraisers weren't, just for show. You think they were laundering money through charity events? Marcus asked. I think, I said, looking at the photos of smiling socialites and beautiful gardens, that nothing in Claire's world was ever what it seemed, and it's time we uncovered every layer of her deception. As we prepared for another trip to Singapore, I caught David staring at the Garden Society photos. You okay? He picked up one showing Claire at a rose show, proudly displaying a blue ribbon. I was just thinking, all those years, watching her tend her prize roses. She spent hours getting everything perfect, eliminating every flaw, pruning away anything that didn't fit her vision. Just like she tried to do with your life, I said quietly. But you can't control everything, he replied, setting down the photo. Sometimes the most beautiful blooms come from the parts of the garden you didn't plan. I squeezed his hand, thinking of the long journey ahead. Claire had tried to prune us from her perfect garden. Instead, she'd only proven that some things grow stronger when you try to cut them down. Now it was time to show her exactly what kind of evidence could bloom from the seeds of her own meticulous record-keeping. The federal courthouse in Portland. Had never seen anything quite like the scene unfolding in courtroom 3. Television crews camped outside, drawn by the irresistible story. Prominent socialite Claire Andrews, president of the Portland Garden Society, on trial for running a sophisticated international fraud scheme through her women's social club. I sat in the witness box, surrounded by screens displaying financial data from Claire's notebooks. The prosecution had saved my testimony for last, building up to this moment through 3 weeks of damning evidence from other society members who'd turned state's evidence. Mrs. Winters, the federal prosecutor, Jana Martinez, approached with one of Claire's notebooks. Can you explain what we're looking at here? I leaned toward the microphone. This is Claire Andrews' coding system for tracking hidden assets. Each flower variety represents a different type of offshore account. Roses for Swiss banks, orchids for Singapore, lilies for the Caymans. And these numbers beside each entry? Percentage fees. The larger the assets hidden, the higher the fee Claire charged for her consulting services. From her seat at the defense table, Claire watched me with cold eyes. She'd traded her designer suits for prison orange, but her posture remained regal, defiant. Her new defense team, brought in after Wu's lawyers abandoned her, scribbled notes frantically. "And how did you discover this code?" Martinez continued. "During my investigation of Wu Enterprises last year, I noticed a pattern in their offshore transactions. Each transfer was logged using horticultural terms. At the time, I assumed it was just Margaret Wu's personal notation system. I pulled up a series of transaction records on the main screen. But after Claire framed me for theft and destroyed evidence in our home, I recognized the same pattern in the Garden Society's charitable foundation records." Objection. Claire's lead attorney stood. "Speculation." "Overruled," Judge Harrison replied. "Continue, Mrs. Winters. I highlighted specific entries. Every major society fundraiser corresponded with large transfers through Azure Horizons, the company Claire created in my name. The amounts matched exactly what society members paid to hide their assets during divorces. And these payments were disguised as charitable donations? Yes. The Garden Society's foundation provided perfect cover. Who would question wealthy women making generous donations to beautify public spaces?" Martinez nodded. "What happened when you tried to investigate these discrepancies?" "Claire orchestrated an elaborate scheme to discredit me. She planted false evidence of theft, created fake bank accounts in my name, and eventually destroyed crucial evidence in a chemical fire designed to look like my attempt to cover up crimes." "The same type of fire used in the Wu bankruptcy case?" "Exactly the same compound. We found the chemical residue analysis in Claire's notebooks, along with detailed plans for framing me." Claire's attorney stood again. "Objection. The notebooks were obtained under questionable circumstances in Singapore." "Your Honor," Martinez interrupted, "we've already established the notebook's authenticity through multiple witnesses, including the defendant's own son." At the mention of David, Claire's mask slipped slightly. She turned to look at him sitting in the gallery, but he kept his eyes forward, focused on the evidence screens. "Mrs. Winters," Martinez continued, "what was the total amount of assets hidden through this scheme? Based on the notebooks and banking records, approximately $112 million over 5 years. Claire's personal profit was roughly $15 million in consulting fees." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even the judge looked shocked. "And the victims? We've identified 63 families directly affected. In most cases, the spouse hiding assets through Claire's system eventually lost everything when the offshore accounts were compromised or the fees became too high." Objection. Claire's attorney tried one last time. "This is pure speculation, based on illegally obtained evidence." "Actually," I said calmly, "it's based on Claire's own meticulous records. She documented everything. Every meeting, every transaction, every victim. She was proud of her system." I turned to look directly at Claire for the first time. She just never expected one of her victims to understand it better than she did. Claire's composure finally cracked. She stood abruptly, ignoring her attorney's attempts to quiet her. "You think you're so clever?" she spat. "Using my own records against me. But you've forgotten something crucial." "Mrs. Andrews," Judge Harrison warned, "sit down or—" "The money's still out there," Claire continued, her voice rising. "Hidden in places you'll never find. And every woman I helped, they're grateful. They understand what I did for them." Martinez smiled slightly. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to play Exhibit 47. The screens flickered to life, showing surveillance footage from the Garden Society's last meeting. One by one, Claire's closest friends discussed their roles in the scheme, unaware they were being recorded. "She promised we'd be protected," one woman sobbed. "Said the accounts were secure. Now everything's gone and she won't even take my calls." "I lost my house," another added. "The fees kept going up, but she said if I tried to back out, she'd expose everything." Claire sank back into her chair, the fight draining from her as she watched her carefully cultivated social network unravel on screen. "Mrs. Winters," Martinez said after the footage ended, "in your professional opinion, What made this scheme so effective? I thought carefully before answering. Claire understood something fundamental about trust. In the world of high society, divorce, women are often told to be suspicious, to protect themselves. She took that fear and weaponized it, offering security while actually making her victims more vulnerable. And the Garden Society provided the perfect cover? More than cover. It provided community. Women who might otherwise have questioned. The scheme felt safe because they were part of something bigger. Something beautiful, even. Claire didn't just steal their money. She stole their trust in each other. As I stepped down from the witness box, I caught David's eye. He nodded slightly, and I saw both pride and pain in his expression. His mother had built her criminal empire on destroyed trust, but in trying to destroy ours, she'd only made it stronger. The jury took less than 4 hours to reach their verdict. As the forewoman stood to deliver it, I watched Claire's face. For the first time since this began, she looked afraid. She had cultivated her garden of deception for years, pruning away anything that threatened to expose the truth. But in the end, the evidence she'd so carefully preserved had bloomed into her downfall. Sometimes the most damaging flowers are the ones you plant yourself. 1 year after Claire's conviction, I stood at the podium of the National Financial Crimes Conference in Washington, D.C., facing a packed auditorium of investigators, prosecutors, and banking officials. Behind me, a screen displayed the intricate web of Claire's Garden Society scheme, now a case study in sophisticated fraud detection. The Andrews Wu conspiracy wasn't just about hidden assets, I explained, highlighting specific nodes in the network. It was about exploiting trust within closed social systems. Every garden club meeting, every charity auction, every afternoon. Tea was an opportunity to identify and groom potential victims. The audience leaned forward as I pulled up Claire's coded notebooks. But the same meticulous record-keeping that protected her operation ultimately became its undoing. Because sometimes, the best evidence comes disguised as roses. A ripple of knowing laughter spread through the crowd. The case had become famous in financial crime circles, not just for its sophistication, but for how it was cracked. The Garden Society scandal, as the media dubbed it, had changed how investigators approached high society fraud. After my presentation, I made my way through the crowd of colleagues and admirers to where David waited. He'd taken a position at Georgetown University Medical Center, combining his surgical practice with research into medical finance fraud. A field we'd discovered was surprisingly interconnected with Claire's. Schemes. Quite a crowd, he said, handing me a coffee. The Singapore banking regulators want to meet for dinner. Apparently, they're implementing new protocols based on your detection methods. I smiled, remembering the vault where we'd found Claire's notebooks. Speaking of Singapore, did you see the latest asset recovery numbers? David nodded. 87% of victim funds recovered. The task force is still unraveling some of the more complex shelters, but most families will get their money back. I checked my phone, where a new email had just arrived. Including the Garden Society's legitimate charitable foundation. The court approved transferring control to the new board today. We made our way to the conference center's rooftop garden, an irony not lost on either of us. The Washington Monument gleamed in the distance as the sun set behind it. Have you heard from her? I asked quietly. It was the first time I'd broached the subject in months. David shook his head. She's still refusing visitors. The prison psychiatrist says she spends most of her time writing detailed accounts of every transaction, every scheme. Still keeping records, I mused. Some habits never die. Mom always did love her documentation. He managed a small smile. Though I doubt these notebooks will be coded in flower names. A gentle breeze carried the scent of actual roses from the garden below. I leaned against the railing, thinking about how much had changed in a year. The FBI's expanding the forensic accounting unit, I said, changing the subject. They want me to head up a new division specializing in social network-based fraud detection, the kind of schemes that hide behind country clubs and charity galas. You're taking it, right? David's eyes lit up with familiar enthusiasm. On one condition. I turned to face him fully. They're partnering with Georgetown Medical Center for a joint task force on healthcare fraud. They need a surgical consultant who understands both medicine and money. His eyebrows rose. A husband-wife, fraud-fighting team. Sounds like a TV show. Sounds like justice, I corrected. Think of how many families we could help. How many schemes we could stop before they destroy lives. David was quiet for a moment, looking out over the city. You know what I realized recently? Mom's Garden Society scheme worked because she understood something fundamental about people. They want to believe they're part of something exclusive, something special. And now? Now we can use that same understanding to protect people instead of exploiting them. He pulled out his phone, showing me an email. The medical center's fraud prevention seminar series is oversubscribed. Doctors, administrators, insurance executives, all wanting to learn how to spot the warning signs. I thought about my presentation earlier, about all the investigators taking notes on Claire's methods. We're turning her poison garden into something healing. Speaking of healing, David reached into his jacket pocket. I found these while cleaning out the old house. He handed me a small velvet box. Inside, nestled on black silk, were my grandmother's sapphire earrings, the ones Claire had hidden during her initial frame-up attempt. They were behind a false panel in her garden shed, David explained, along with documentation of her first attempts to create azure horizons. Apparently, she'd been planning this for years. I touched the sapphires gently. And now there'll be evidence in the next round of prosecutions? Actually, David smiled. The FBI cleared them for return. Something about the statute of limitations and already having enough evidence. I thought, maybe you could wear them to the Georgetown Fraud Prevention Symposium next month? Show everyone that what's stolen can be reclaimed. Tears pricked at my eyes as I fastened the earrings in place. In their reflection in the window, I caught a glimpse of the woman I'd become. Stronger, wiser, but still fundamentally unchanged in the ways that mattered. Claire had tried to bury me in her garden of lies. Instead, I'd bloomed into someone who could prevent others from suffering the same fate. Ready to go meet those Singapore bankers? David asked, offering his arm. I took it, feeling the weight of the sapphires, not just jewelry now, but symbols of transformation. Ready. Though let's skip the garden-themed restaurant they suggested. I think we've had enough flowers for one lifetime. As we left the rooftop, I caught one last whiff of roses on the evening breeze. Somewhere in a federal prison, Claire was still writing her meticulous records, still trying to maintain control through documentation. But her garden of deception had withered, while the truth she'd tried to bury had grown into something powerful and protecting. Sometimes the best revenge isn't just surviving, it's transforming the weapons used against you into tools for helping others survive too. And that's exactly what we intended to do, one case at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.